Okay, thank you. I'm going to recognize David to make a few introductory remarks about how the process will go. We want to keep this moving on as rapidly as possible because we've got a lot of materials to go through. And this today is more of the 10,000 foot looking down rather than getting too caught up in the weeds. So if we're getting too low to the ground, I'm going to have to move things along. So please try to keep our comments general and forceful and follow the lead of our very successful and good consultants here. So David, with that, I'll turn it over to you and then we can move on.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this was intended to be a working lunch. I know everybody's got some food in front of them, so please feel free to continue eating as we begin our discussion. I know we're getting started a little bit early, but I know several people have other things that they need to do this afternoon. So for the sake of everyone's time and being respectful and sensitive to that, we're gonna get moving early. We're going to start out, really talking about the purpose of TBARTA. And per the TBARTA Act, we have two basic powers and duties. One, to plan, implement, and operate mobility improvements and expansions of multimodal transportation options throughout our designated region. And secondly, to produce a regional transit development plan, which will lay out how we'll plan, implement, and operate mobility improvements. So, why are we having a workshop? Well, the statute doesn't really say much else about our roles and responsibilities. Through our TDP, we have an opportunity to transform TBARTA into an authority with meaningful regional transit leadership and clear responsibility for regional transit services. It would certainly be easier to not do anything, but there are many reasons that we have to change. And I want to, highlight a couple of comparison statistics that came out of the peer review. You may recall, as part of the regional TDP, we did an analysis of some other peer regions throughout the U.S. One of the reasons that regions or areas avoid doing anything related to transit is density. And interestingly, of the 7 regions, Tampa Bay has the highest population density, and it's not just density for its population. Of the 7, we also have the highest employment density as well, of all of those 7 regions. Our congestion rank is about middle of the road. Across the United States, we rank 17th, but we have greater congestion than San Diego, Minnesota, and Phoenix, who are other regions we looked at, who, interestingly, have far superior transit systems than we do in Tampa Bay. Our growth rate of the 7 regions is the highest. The percentage of our population 65 and older, highest. The percentage of our population in poverty, second highest, behind only Phoenix. Our median income compared to those other regions, lowest. The percentage of our population that commutes by car is the highest. The percentage of our population that commutes by transit, lowest. And the percentage of our population that rides bicycles, lowest. So it's no surprise that Tampa Bay ranks 77th in the infamous Brookings Institution Transit Report, despite being a top 20 region. And that same report ranks us 93rd in terms of job access. And it's no surprise that Tampa and St. Petersburg rank 98th and 99th in Wallet Hub's report this year on the top 100 cities with the best transit service, or worst transit service in our case. So this is an opportunity to set a new course. I encourage you throughout our conversation today to think big and think bold. Some of the ideas mentioned today might be uncomfortable, but these are the same conversations had by other regions who shared some of your same concerns. So we're not unique in that regard. We might think we are, but we're not. The difference is they found a way to work through their differences. They figured it out for the good of their regions, and we're to the point where we need to do the same. We have that authority, and we have that duty. And to do this, we need some direction from TBARTA's board today. We have 3 expectations for the day. Number 1, to review TBARTA's purpose and vision and the guiding principles that you all established 2 years ago. Secondly, to understand issues that influence how regional transit is defined. And most importantly, number 3, to provide that high-level direction the chair just talked about regarding TBARTA's future roles in regional transit planning, funding, operations, and brand Envision. And all of those things will inform the Envision 2030 action plan that we submit to FDOT next spring. One last point I want to make is that we're going to try to get through as many of these items as possible, but we also recognize, based on how the conversation goes, we might not have that opportunity. If we don't, we certainly will come back to the board at a future board meeting in order to complete those conversations and receive that input that we're looking for. So with that, I will turn it over to Bob Clifford to begin the workshop.
Thank you, David. Appreciate being here. It's a little bit of deja vu, being back with you all. Definitely appreciate the opportunity. And again, talking about what David was talking about in terms of setting the stage, what does TBARTA want to be, where do you want to be going, and aligning your goals and vision, and the activities that you engage in, that you have staff engaged in. They're looking for direction, and we're going to get down to kind of 4 key areas. But before we go to that, the one thing I did want to point out to you is this information that is provided to you all. There's a lot of good information, particularly from the peer evaluation effort in there, to take a look at, think about as we're having the conversation in terms of making decisions or giving direction, if you will, related to planning and funding and operations and branding. Looking at that peer evaluation, everybody did it a little bit differently, and I think the big takeaway that the team has from that is it really is dependent upon what works for you, what works for this region. There is no roadmap for it, but there is a lot of good information within here as we're having the conversation. So I encourage you to look at this as you desire as we have the conversation. Starting through the first couple of slides are very brief, just really setting the stage. David did this for you for the first couple of them, so I'm not going to reiterate them. Talking about the workshop expectations, talking about your Envision 2030 plan, the action plan in terms of that regional transit development plan and how that gets implemented and how you move forward with that. The other side of it is going to what your purpose and vision. We provided some information for you just as reference to think about. Are we still in the same place? Do they still matter? Is that what we view as our purpose and vision for the region? But then you really start to go to, we broke the guiding principles down very specifically and the goals as opposed to one big statement, just in terms of the different items that are part of it. And one of the things to be thinking about today, do these still apply? Are these the things that you as an agency want to be thinking about, want to be looking at, want to act on? Because that's really where we're trying to go, is from an action item perspective, setting the stage so that your staff can go out and do those things to put this agency in the place that you all decided what you want it to be. Really, the first thing we really begin to start with, I'll stop trying to move around, is the regional transit network. And so one of the things that was defined as part of the Envision plan was, from a technical basis, looking at what is regional transit. And the things that were utilized or are being utilized in the development act from a technical perspective are service that crosses a county line. A very simple definition or a jurisdiction. Service that has regional impact, connecting to activity centers. And then service that may be coordinated amongst several different entities, several different transit agencies. The question that we would all ask you is, does that apply? Does that make sense from your perspective as a board? Are those the things that you would just generally at a high level, recognizing there are certain nuances that may not apply in every area, but does that make sense in terms of as we would define regional transit? And so, Mr. Chair, I would ask y'all, do y'all agree with that? Is that we on the right track with that?
Absolutely on the right track.
I definitely think you're on the right track, and I think that one comment that I had made is population patterns change, and certain, economic hub centers develop up, given what's happening in Tampa, what's happening in St. Petersburg, what's happening in Pasco County, Hernando County, Manatee County. It's really not an artificial county barrier anymore. It's connectivity of hubs, of economic hubs and of population hubs. And I don't know whether the board agrees with that, but
I couldn't agree more, Mr. Chair. I think you're right on target. We've had many discussions over the last several years about this vision, what a regional transit system looks like, feels like, and clearly, in my opinion, our TBARTA agency is perfectly positioned to jumpstart this whole entire area into the future. And I think that's why we're all here. And I'm excited about the opportunities.
would other members like to comment on that? Cliff?
One checklist item we might want to add to this slide as we move forward with your presentation, we have member governments that are supporting our effort, and that coordination among several local transit agencies should include coordination with all of our member governments that don't seem to stay up sometimes with where we're moving to, and they're now all vested partners financially.
Good point. Excellent point. They're not necessarily the same entity. You have
They're not.
particularly
We have a lot of different.
right, and well, particularly in Hillsborough and Pinellas County, they are not the transit agencies are not part of county government. They are their own entities. To that point, is it also? Would you also say it's fair to assume from the perspective of the criteria that it also is incremental over time? So a project may be in just one county initially, but the bigger picture is it's over many, it connects to many counties. For example, the RRT, what Scott was talking to you about a few minutes ago, the first pieces of that, as it gets implemented, may only be in one county. However, it's understood it's part of a bigger connection that connects with multiple communities and really does focus as regional transit. Is it fair to assume that we're also including that?
Absolutely. I mean, Hernando County knows, for example, that what's happening in Hillsborough, St. Pete, Pasco is really our future. So we're connected and want to participate. So that education and coordination amongst member governments allows them to understand what's going on and how eventually they need to be prepared for it. Because there's things they could be doing now, Bob, to prepare for this future, where it'd be really simple to engage in comp plan overlays and different kinds of things to anticipate a future that looks like something that's being built now in Pasco County. And it saves a lot of time in the future when you get there if some of that foresight has been implemented.
How does TBARTA help in that?
If you put that last little checkbox on there, I think we should coordinate with our member government.
Okay.
And educate them so that, the commissioners and folks that aren't able to sit on the board are fully invested in why transit's such an important component of our region.
Okay.
Well, I would add to that, Cliff, that perhaps even in one county, in Pasco, Pinellas, Hillsborough, whatever, if there are hubs of really regional significance, for example, just using an example, Tampa Airport and the downtown Tampa area, even though that's in one county, that's still of regional significance to all of us. And that's something TBARTA should be engaged in and not be hamstrung by this artificial county line definition of regionalism.
Okay, perfect.
In outreach to other major interchanges, right now there's master planning and development going on at I-75 and 50 in Hernando. There's no reason why they couldn't look to their future and start planning for the kinds of things you need to make these systems work today when they get that far north. And they'll eventually get there. And as you know, all transportation planning takes 20 years, so.
Sometimes longer. I appreciate that. Moving on, just to briefly to kind of show you a little bit about the peer review recap. As you see in looking at all of those different entities, and just if you're not aware, so we have Atlanta, we have, my eyes are, there's Minneapolis, we have Seattle, we have San Diego, we have South Florida, Phoenix and South Florida. So kind of a broad array of different peer entities that look at transit from a regional perspective. And you see they do different things in terms of the different types of activities that they engage in, that they have a role in, and what their roles or responsibilities are. No action item on that, but just to look at it in those 4 areas, which is really what we're talking about: planning, operations, funding, and then branding from that perspective. So going to the next slide, if you talk about starting in planning, the reality is this entity is already engaged in quite a bit of planning. You talk about what you're doing with the Envision 2030 plan, with the Regional Transit Development Plan. That's underway. I know Bill and his staff, Bill Ball with Tyndall Oliver and his staff, been working on that with you all. Just had the briefing this morning about the regional rapid transit, the BRT on the interstate system. And then also from the perspective of regional commuting services, the activities that you all undertake in that area. Let's talk about the van pool program and other activities that are part of the package of activities and responsibilities that this agency has. So from a planning perspective, it's something we recognize you're already doing part of that. The question is, what else or what more should you be involved in? Are you interested in being involved in? Does it make sense to be involved in as we start to go? Because there are other areas. You start to talk about other projects. So there's the capital side of projects. There's the operational side of planning. Service planning is something that local transit agencies, that's their mission in terms of providing that local service. And then it's the issue of other activities like, I thought it was very interesting listening to the innovation discussion this morning about technology and innovations and consistency, amongst entities within the region. This is always a challenge when we're talking about new technologies, new software, new operations. How do you do it so that you ensure consistency amongst potentially different implementing entities throughout the region, so that you can talk to each other? That it truly is, at the end of the day, seamless for a customer, that they don't notice any difference. They just know I got on it and I got off it from where I wanted to where I wanted to go. So those, just be thinking about that as we go to these next questions, in terms of what should be this entity's focus when we talk about planning. In terms of, do you lead all transit planning? Is it more focused on just the regional aspect of planning? Are you focused on the seamless integration of it, which is a little bit of a combination of both? And then, the question of the work you're already doing, how does it aggregate back into local plans? Every transit agency is required to do a transit development plan. This entity is required to do a regional transit development plan. How do you ensure that consistency and ensuring that the information is going both ways, and that it is consistent, it is all aggregated, and it makes sense? So the way I described it the other day we were talking was, there's many different puzzle pieces. How are we ensuring all the puzzle pieces are fitting together? And what is this entity's role in ensuring that those puzzle pieces fit together? Threw a lot of different questions out there, thoughts, open to kind of a free range of what you all think, in those various areas.
One thing I noticed too, to kind of kick off the conversation and reviewing the data on the ATL, the new ATL project in Atlanta, and I'll preface that by saying Atlanta does have merged MPOs in multiple counties, so they have overcome an obstacle there to parochialism. Mm-hmm. But as I understand it, they have believed to basically run the funding through the new ATL as opposed to the local counties and city governments that have regional significance to them. So that's something that this organization needs to consider. Mr. Long.
So I would like to capitalize on what the chair just said by reminding everyone that clearly our legislature had an incentive to this question by having all of the regional asks for money from the legislature as it related to transportation flow through TBARTA. So because there are many of us on this big board that represent different counties, it seems to me that as board members, we have a responsibility to ensure that our MPOs and our transit agencies, for example, are communicating our processes back and forth. I know David talks with our PSTA folks. Our MPO people are in conversation all the time. So I think it is becoming a seamless, integrated communication network of transit geeks, for lack of a better word to refer to us all as.
So when we talk about planning, and we talk about, in this case, transit planning, recognizing there's this entity, there's local transit agencies, there's cities, there's counties, there's also other entities that have a say in that planning side of things. You've got multiple regional planning councils, so you've got the whole land use side of it.
Well, actually,
You
in our
have-
region, we have one. It's Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council, and it's made up of 7
You're
counties.
correct, you're correct now. We used to have more than one. We have different DOT districts. You know, there's different entities, you know, in terms of how do you coordinate the planning to ensure that it's consistent. I guess the question I would ask you is, what do you see this entity as a leader, a facilitator, a developer of those activities, and in what pieces? Just the regional piece, beyond the regional piece? You know, in what areas do you see potentially where this agency's position or role would be?
I think it's all of the above.
Yeah, I would concur that it's all of the above, and I would even put forth a more radical idea for discussion, and that is, you know, to get beyond some of the issues that have happened locally in terms of taxation and the votes that have occurred on that. And I don't know that the legislature is going to be that receptive to this now, but maybe down the road they will be as this develops. Regional transit potentially ought to, TBARTA or a merged organization with some other organizations here, ought to have independent taxing authority as a possibility for projects of regional significance. I don't know how the other board members feel about that.
I think that's an interesting question, and I'd like to know if that is how it is in some of the other areas.
It really, I'm going to bring Bill up on the peer analysis. It really just depends on what their mechanisms are.
You're talking about funding in particular, right? So in all cases, each of the regional entities we looked at around the country have dedicated local funding sources for the regional focus. So it really is a key part of the success of any regional entity. For TBARTA to have success in the future, you must identify what that funding source is going to be. You know you can't live year to year by getting the legislature to fund you on an annual basis. So if you look at each one of those individual examples, they could be a regional sales tax. They are, I guess, what other examples? Motor vehicle tax, rental car fees, sales tax. There's just different sources that each of them use, whatever works the best in those communities.
But do those sources extend over multiple taxing jurisdictions?
Some do, some don't. Some have a regional sales tax that goes over all the counties within the region, and then the counties within the region may have also have additional taxes on top of that.
It seems if we could get there, that if TBARTA had taxing authority, then it would be simpler for us. You know, I represent my board here, but I'm one vote on my board.
Mm-hmm.
So
Of course, you don't have taxing authority in your legislation now,
Yeah.
so that would be something, if you chose to put that as a priority, that we would incorporate in the plan as something that you would pursue.
And it could work with each member government having their own separate taxing authority. It doesn't have to be regional. I mean, we could take a regional tax to the individual governments and have them implement it for.
I can give you a good example in Atlanta where they set up the regional entity, and the regional legislation set up the ability for each county within that region to have their own tax, but then the transit projects they fund with that tax have to be part of the regional plan that the ATL in that example puts together. So there's multiple ways to do that. If you wanted to keep it at the county level, you could do that under a regional structure like they are pursuing in Atlanta.
I think that's the only way we would move forward here. That makes sense, I think. I mean, the individual governments probably aren't going to just relinquish that authority, I'm assuming.
Right.
So education starts first.
Well, to that point too, and I've asked these guys to maybe provide us with the enabling legislation. Georgia just went through this, and it was apparently a very well thought out process on how they developed this new ATL, and we're looking at doing that.
Absolutely, and I think, you know, it's interesting, we all recognize all roads always end up leading to funding when we talk about transportation, and we struggled with what the order of the different elements would be. I'm actually calling an audible, and we're going to go to funding, because that's really, it ends up driving the other pieces, the planning, the operations, the branding side of it. And there's really, when you talk about funding, there's really two elements to it. One is related to projects, the other is related to your own operations. You know, in terms of when you look at funding. So when you think about it, so one of the things to keep in mind is TBARTA, via the Van Pool program, does bring money to this region that this region would not receive otherwise. It's federal money through the National Transit Database Program based on the vehicle miles traveled that you receive funding for, and the transit operators also receive a portion of that funding that they would have not received otherwise. So there is value in terms of what you're delivering in terms of real, not necessarily product, but funding to the region from a transit perspective. It's not a lot, but it's a start. You know, so then you look at the other side of it is having the regional transit development plan, and by doing that, you'll be eligible for state block grants. Again, it won't be a lot of money, be a small, but it will be additional money to this region that it does not receive. So we just, that's not a question as much as it's just to let you know, kind of set the stage from a factual perspective. Start to look at, in terms of what is your role related to funding, not how do you get it, we'll get to that in a minute, but what is your role? Do you administer funding? Do you distribute it? Is it related to all projects, just transit projects? Do you not be involved in it? Does it go down to, you know, flow a different way? You know, one of the discussions that you heard this morning, somebody mentioned about the issue of being a designated recipient for federal funds. You know, what is the role of the transit development plan that you're developing now, in terms of, which is laying out what the projects are, and then part of that is where does the funding come from? And what is your role within that? So something to think about in terms of how you want to look at transit project funding and what you see your role being for that.
Mr. Chair, I have
Got it.
clarification questions regarding the scope of the discussion. Is this a question of, when we think, and I ask the question, what should be the focus of TBARTA planning efforts, and we go on from there, is this within the parameters of what our current understanding of our jurisdictional authority is, and we're looking at 2030, and within that constraint, we're trying to find the best way forward? Or is this a conversation expanding potentially the jurisdictional authority based on what we think is best for the region, and then we may go and try to get that authority as we go forward? Which is the constraints or
My
the
response to that
parameters?
would be yes.
Yes and yes.
It's really what you all believe it should be, whichever way.
Well, I believe we already have that authority by virtue of our implementing statute.
Well, I
For a transit
think what
tax,
it defines is, it
No,
says,
to,
Yeah.
TBARTA's role is to plan, development, and operate regional transit services.
correct.
But we don't have the funding to do that. So we need to put the plan together and identify the things that are missing to allow TBARTA to do that.
And ask for the funding. But
So, I mean, from my perspective, there's no reason why we should pursue funding for transit through TBARTA and not control it. And then secondly, the current funding strategy of asking every year for operational funding or special projects funding is a dead-end street, as you know, in long-range transportation planning. So we've got to start thinking about a transit tax or a source of funding or implementing strategy. I'm sure Atlanta did, I'm sure Orlando did, I'm sure Miami did. I mean, they've all found their way to a continuing source of funding, and then they move their transit projects along. It's not going to work any other way, from my perspective.
Okay.
Question?
Yes, ma'am.
So at what point did they go for taxing authority? Did they have a plan and then go for taxing authority, or did they get taxing authority and then go for the plan?
It's, again, that's the same, it's a little bit of both, it's the chicken or the egg, which way is the right way, and again, that really is more dependent upon what would work within that community in terms of getting it, with the process, which way to do it. Some would argue you need a full plan and then get the money, and that's worked in some locations. Others are, no, it's more of a vision, let's get the money, and then we can determine what the plan is.
I like a plan
I
and
mean,
then go
the-
after the
the
money,
re-
but, I mean, Chairman Holt said a few minutes ago, is it too radical to discuss? I mean, we have to discuss it. I don't see.
Well, I
don't
think
see
we
any
have
way
discussed,
forward
I mean, in
otherwise.
terms of an actual legislative ask now. I don't know if the legislature would have that, but I think as we develop along and make the
Well,
case
after we
for
get
it-
our ask, then we can go with your radical concept, but we're gonna obviously have to get there.
The way I would describe it is there are many different nuances and issues, individual issues, kind of what ifs, what about this, how would this work, how would that work? Think about it from a little bit higher level of, think about it, do we want this agency to be a designated recipient and have funding flow through it for regional projects? To me, that's kind of a, more of a higher level question. How do we get there? Those start to become the pieces, but if, you want to be a designated recipient, is then that for just regional projects? Or is it for all funding for transit? That's where the road starts to split. In terms of the layers of how it would go. But the question could be, we believe this entity should be the designated recipient for regional transit, for funding for regional transit projects. How it gets distributed and who it goes to and who would implement it, that's still to be determined. But a bigger picture is, we agree with that, or maybe you don't. But I'm just looking at it, from that perspective. It helps give guidance in how to put the plan together in terms of, it gives you direction in terms of where you're headed.
Well, I wholeheartedly agree with it, and I think if you look historically in terms of all transportation, not just transit, that historically Washington, D.C. and the feds favor groups, larger regional segments to be a funnel for dollars as opposed to individual counties or cities or whatever. And that's something that this area has wrestled with for many years, and all of us have been involved one way or the other in those battles. But the facts are the facts are the facts. Washington favors regionalism, and it favors giving more money to regions that have their act together and cooperate.
But that said, Mr. Chair, it's also Washington that directs the federal money through the MPO. And since we all have an MPO, it goes to our MPO, and then where does TBARTA fit with that?
Well, that's true in terms of normal highway planning, but transit could get in another way. That's what I'm saying. What we have not been able to accomplish by merger of the MPOs, there might be a backdoor.
The actual money, in terms of when you receive it for projects or for grants, doesn't flow through the MPOs. It flows through the designated recipients. Has to be in the MPO plans, different issue. But
But
yes,
that's why
ma'am.
we have an opportunity
Right.
Right.
as TBARTA, because if you
Precisely.
look at these other peer agencies, it was by combining counties
Right.
and doing a regional project that, this would differentiate us as being the recipient, and would put us in a very good spot. to accomplish the regional project.
Right, and maybe encourage them to merge, seeing the opportunity there.
Right.
Yeah.
But we already made the decision today to be a direct recipient. We've got the application, and now we're gonna hire someone. So now is the question, are we gonna just use the money for regional?
Well, that's your that's
I
your
think that is
determination.
the question. The statute already identifies TBARTA as the designated
correct.
recipient for
Right.
inter-county transit projects and any intra-county project that may be a phase of an inter-county project.
Okay, well then, we answered the question.
But then it's, the conversation is, does it go beyond that? Is it just regional service, or could it include anything beyond that?
Well, for that, I think for today, it ought to be just regional so that we can have a focus.
Sort of
What's beyond regional? When you say
Yeah, what's beyond regional? I
what's
don't,
beyond
I
regional?
don't know what you mean.
Are we connecting us to Atlanta or something? I mean, where do we go beyond?
I could give another example of what they're planning for in Atlanta, which is all future state and federal dollars that come to the Atlanta region are going to flow through the ATL. But it's going to continue to go to the local, there's 13 operators within the region. And so MARTA is still going to get their dollars, it's just going to flow through the ATL. But moving forward, there will be more of an emphasis on making sure that any projects that are funded are on the regional plan and supportive of the regional approach. It's a big step forward, and they've made it there, and it's still being
Did they
implemented.
start there, though? Did they
What's that?
start there, or did they move
No,
there?
that's the
Grown
end goal in the legislation, and now they're transitioning.
That's what the model Georgia state legislation did for this ATL, because of some of the competitors with DeKalb County and Cobb County and Fulton County
And
that we've experienced here.
to be clear, so in the history of my relationship with TBARTA, we're pursuing transit projects, implementing regional transit plans and systems. We are not moving toward operation of transit, right?
Yeah.
We're not planning to operate transit systems.
That's
Who's
part of the
gonna-
question
That's-
Well,
today.
that's what it
That's going to be one of the questions.
discussion.
We haven't
I mean-
decided that.
You're going
I
ahead.
vote no.
I have an open mind on
Well,
that.
Yeah,
operation,
I do
have an
too.
open mind on that, too.
Well, that was my question
Someone's gotta
earlier.
do
That
it.
was the whole question about the parameters within which
Yeah.
this discussion.
Well-
What if there was funding? What if funding wasn't an issue? Then what's the ideal scenario for TBARTA if funding wasn't an issue?
well, you can still receive the money and then sub out to an operator.
Right, we
transit
can have a
operator.
seamless system
We're
and
talking
still have
about
separate
being the
operators.
funnel
We
of
don't
the
have
money.
to
Yeah,
operate all
correct.
systems.
Well, that's precisely what Atlanta does.
Yeah.
I mean,
County.
yeah, you could,
But essentially
you
what
could bid
he's-
it out.
Right,
For,
precisely.
we could be the agency
But
that
what-
bids
but
it out to
what
see
he's
what
saying
kind
We
of.
is
really are
all-
growing now.
Yeah.
All federal dollars coming into Tampa Bay would be, for transit, would be run through
So-
TBARTA and given to, to HART, to PSTA, to other
Okay.
agencies.
So right now, federal money goes to each one of our transit systems within our county.
Correct.
Of which mine is part of the county, yours, Pinellas and Hillsborough, they're separate agencies, so the
Correct.
county doesn't see that money anyway, but they're represented by a county commissioner on their board,
Right.
right?
Correct, correct. We have
Um,
4 county commissioners on our transit board.
Yeah, well, as
And
long
then you
as,
take another step because the MPOs also receive transit dollars as well that they distribute.
yeah,
So
so,
it's kind of,
it's, the devil's in the details, is if everyone's still getting the same amount of money, does it matter the flow, as long as you're getting what you need?
I'll defer to these guys in
Well,
terms of efficiency and what they're.
Well, part of it is what's your role? Where does this agency fit in with all the rest? And if you're taking the mantle and the lead of a of regional transit projects, then the question is, how do those get funded? The question a minute ago, who controls it? Is it TBARTA, or do you say, no, we don't want to do that, we'll have somebody else do it? You're all flipping it the other way of, okay, well, what about all the other local stuff? That's fine. The question is which way makes the most sense. The other thing I would say, though, is you do see, and it was made earlier, the point was made earlier, if you're speaking with one voice, I think the Secretary would back this up at the state level, it's the same question, you all know this. if you speak with one voice and there's one entity doing the speaking, you have more chance of being successful.
Yeah, I see if there are multiple transit agencies jockeying for operation and implementation, if that's what you're talking about, that's a mess, I think.
Well, but I think it's important when you look at the pure information. So one of the things to keep in mind, it can work many different ways, and the one we always go to often is Valley Transit in Phoenix. There's 8 operators,
Huh?
7 different operators. Nobody knows the difference. The money flows through Valley, but down to the operators. The operators didn't change. But in terms of delivering service to customers in a seamless, one-branded fashion, it works.
So
So
are
there's- I mean,
the
the po-
vehicles branded, or are
Yes.
there 8 different
No, the
brand?
vehicles are branded.
So everyone's operating the same brand down the highway, just different, ones are belonging to different agencies?
Different operators operate them.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I just tell you that just from the perspective of, we're trying to have this conversation, and I get that it's difficult from a kind of 4 buckets: planning, funding, operations, branding. The reality is everything crosses amongst them. This decision then affects this decision, then affects this decision, which is fine. Just trying to think from a bigger picture of how you would want to look at it and how you see this agency's role and responsibility within that. That's really what we're talking about. From a conceptual basis, understanding there's a lot of details that have to get worked out, but just conceptually, does that make sense from TBARTA's perspective to be the one voice, be the designated recipient, and I'll say just at this stage, for regional projects?
Yes.
Yeah, you gotta have
Okay.
one regional.
And my thought with it would be that could work and still have multiple operators.
Yes.
It doesn't have to be one operator.
Correct.
Okay.
Control the funding, one voice, multiple operators.
And to further the point too, in terms of branding, it makes sense to me, and use the example of the tourists flying from Germany to Tampa International Airport, them seeing one brand that's going to take them to Sarasota, to Manatee County, to Pasco County, to Hillsborough County, to Pinellas Beaches. They're going to want to see that one common symbol, maybe have a PDA that tells them the timing and the same kind of interoperable tickets and everything else, just like they get around in Europe. They don't have multiple, transit agencies throughout Europe. They usually have 1 or 2 on the Eurail and the different things within a different country.
One app, one pass, be able to travel all over Tampa Bay.
Right.
Okay.
But not get in the weeds and say you can't have but one operator.
That's a fair concept, right? That
Right.
we're looking for.
Well said.
So now, what about for your own internal operations?
But we have local taxes for our own internal operations.
Well, a couple questions to consider. How do you demonstrate value? What sources do you utilize? There's grants, there's taxes, local contributions, potentially other. And then what are the steps needed to secure funding? I know you're in process in some of these things, but we wanted to ask the question as you think down the road, how does this entity sustain itself and grow?
You gotta go back to that slide and put that 4th check on there.
Okay.
Start coordinating with your local governments.
Okay.
That's one thing you gotta do. We gotta do. Because local governments do not stay up with this, and they're not visited with often enough. And they should be a big supporter of what we're doing, and they're now vested partners.
Well,
We're
we
asking
are
them to
sup-
put money in, I know, but I mean, they need to be educated, and periodically should do workshops and keep the boards kind of in tow,
Well, we do-
other than just through their relationships, through a single commissioner.
A point is that, we hear Commissioner Kemp say things. I have no idea if that's what her fellow board members are saying. I have no idea. I hear what she says, and again, I'm here representing my board, but when it comes down to a vote, if we had to raise money for this or whatever, I'm just one vote. So I do think it's really important that we have that outreach to fellow board members like you're saying.
Well, and I will clarify that as my understanding too from discussions here earlier that whether the Hillsborough County Commission voted for that or not, their MPO did.
Yeah,
And that's the more decisive factor
yeah,
there.
and I'm glad the secretary cleared the air on that one.
And I know that David comes and makes a presentation to us, right? And don't you go to the other counties as well?
When I can, yes.
Well, I think that needs to be done on a yearly basis if you want
More,
the money.
more than yearly,
Maybe quarterly, I don't know.
yeah,
I think they should see us more often.
yeah.
You've benefited, Commissioner Long, for a more direct connection, and you've stayed very educated. That's not the same across the whole footprint.
And you've got 2 commissioners on this board, and Hillsborough has Hart and others that sit on the MPO. I'm only 1 vote from Pasco.
Well, maybe that needs to be looked at going forward legislatively.
Well, we
'cause
tried
can't
very
change-
hard. Senator Latvala was very against that. Now, I'm trying to get the other gubernatorial position to be a Pasco County person, so we have another voice. But, you know, nothing's happened yet. But yeah, again, so I'm 1 voice in Pasco County, which in my opinion is not big enough.
Wow. I agree.
When you're talking about local contributions, how does this entity, going back to those local entities, the counties, how do you demonstrate this entity's value?
It's by population right now, right?
No, I'm just saying in terms of asking for money, question is, okay, why am I giving you money? What is the value?
The value is that we're going to have service of some type.
Yeah, yeah. We're going to have
We're
a
going to
regional
finally have
transit operation. government.
Operations.
Yeah,
And they can essentially outsource this other services to us to be a conduit for everyone and shoulder some of that burden.
Well, Mr. Chair, this is a realistic issue from the Manatee County perspective because we're not necessarily sure how TBARTA with the regional planning could impact Manatee County. And this question as far as funding have come up from my fellow commissioners as far as I think we did proceed this year, but I'm not necessarily sure how it's going to look in the future because of the current scope or the current vision of TBARTA doesn't necessarily include Manatee County. We have some thoughts in some ways on how it could potentially, but there's nothing concrete. So when you start talking about funding, there's a reality that funds from Manatee County could decrease.
Well, I think we need that input.
Right.
We need
But
to
to-
go down there and listen.
And one thing I've recommended, yes, ma'am, go ahead.
Well, to your point, you're not even in the same DOT district.
Right.
And when I first came on TBARTA, your DOT secretary used to sit right there next to Secretary Gwen. And I haven't seen, I don't know if it's still a him, but I haven't seen that person since we had our meeting down in Manatee County.
Well, maybe we'll see him on the 17th.
So, I don't know, I mean, that's a problem, and I've talked to Ron about whether or not it might be possible to move those lines, Secretary Gwynn, so that they can be part of our district?
Well, I don't think we can necessarily move the lines.
Why not?
Well, the legislature, I guess, could move it if they wanted to. But
Create a District 7 out of District 1.
you know, there had been talks at one time about a potential district in Southwest Florida and perhaps reconfiguring, because some people question, you know, is Polk County, you know, with Lakeland being part of our region and some of that, so it's difficult. I can say for LK, and I know he tries to get here when he can. Unfortunately, this falls on the same date as several of his MPO board meetings down in the south part of the state, and so I know he always has somebody here. They don't always sit up at the desk, but I know, and he calls me to talk about it, so I know he's interested, but you're right, he hasn't been here that much, but this morning there was their planning manager was here in attendance, so.
So from the Manatee County perspective, I looked at it from an ROI, you know, what's going to be our return
Correct.
on our investment. And we're just not there yet. We need to identify how we're going to get there, but hopefully some of that will come up within this workshop. And we have opportunity to talk some of these things out, but the return on investment when they go back, I'm only 1 vote also. Commissioner Starkey, so, and it's not a loud one neither. So I think the reality of it is, how those funds are going to eventually come back and impact Manatee County needs to be at the forefront, and that's to every county.
I think you're kind of in the same position as Hernando.
Right?
Correct.
Hernando citizens will benefit from what happens south of them, and I think your citizens will eventually
North.
benefit what's happening north of them.
Right.
Because I'm sure if you're driving to TIA, you're feeling the same pain as they're feeling when they're driving south. So it may not be touching you yet, but I think once a system is in place, your residents will benefit too. But granted, it's a longer-term play.
Right,
the
I
challenge.
believe in it. One
Yeah.
last thing, I
Honestly,
believe in
you're
it, but I
coming.
have to make sure that
Yeah.
the other commissioners believe in it also.
But to your question is, how does TBARTA demonstrate value in Manatee?
Yeah.
Is the same as you
Right.
mentioned in Hernando. The challenge is clarifying that to a point that it's quantifiable related to the taxes and the investment from the county. That's the challenge.
And there are, you at least have a start related to that, because as I mentioned earlier, you do have money coming back because of the van pool program, because, that NTD funding. So there is an opportunity to show value back, and breaking that down, so there's a start. I'm not sure that meets the need in terms of what you're looking for a return on investment, but it certainly begins that effort of, hey, we're bringing value back to this region and to the localities within this region that if we didn't exist and provide this service, this region wouldn't get. You know.
So Joe Lovano earlier said we have 5 billion people in our region that we're serving, and he made it a point to say that our friends to the south in Manatee use the airport a lot. Part of our investment for transit improvements is at the airport, so we're serving all. When you do a transit project in Pinellas, Hillsborough, connecting the airport, West, whatever we're working on, it serves the entire 5 million people. And that's how we feel in Hernando. I mean, while these improvements are being done, when I want to go to the airport, I enjoy a transit project. If I can get up here by bus, I'm going to be on it. So the investment being made in the core spreads out to the network. You can't start outside and work in. It always starts from the center and works out. It's just the way transportation, especially transit, works. So I see all the investments being made in the Tampa Bay area as benefiting Hernando County, although we don't have a single transit project up there, probably won't have for years, unless you can get that rail built up to my little hub there in South
Because you got all that
Brooksville.
money already.
But we see ourselves in the future of good planning in the core.
Well, as you look at
Fair.
the development fill-in and the geography and the demographic fill-in, you're going to see, as far as Sarasota County, and as north as Hernando County, all kind of merging together in the next 20 years. So some of the issues now that we are grappling with will be moved at that time, because there's all going to be, it's going to be indistinguishable from an area like Atlanta that grew in the same way. Assuming the population increases still continue to happen, which there's every indication that's happening.
When you
And the
think of,
BRT is a great example. I mean, we're moving up the interstate, we're getting to Wesley Chapel, we've got a plan in place that may be funded and ultimately implemented. But without that BRT connection from Tampa Bay up to Wesley Chapel, it's never getting any further north. So I look at these things as phased improvements. Most transit projects are. And what you need to do is stay invested in that future and prepare your community for that future. And with that, you can bring some benefit to your constituents.
as you grow and you think about how you're presently funded in terms of the operations of the agency, combination of different things, do you see that staying the same? Do you see local contribution being more, being less, staying the same? Are there more grants? Is there another mechanism that you need to explore in terms of dedicated funding at a local, regional, or state level? I mean, or even a federal level. How do you envision, or what do you see, or what would you like to see from the perspective of securing this entity's financial future, and then thinking about how it proceeds in the future and grows?
My first blush is more dedicated funding, because I think that's the real sustainability there. And that's going to increase as population increases and usage increases too. If you have to rely on local matches all the time and all that, you're subject to different political shifting winds. But if you have a dedicated source of revenue, you can naturally expand and even potentially decrease local contributions if the numbers warrant it. I mean, and communities that have done that, I think that BART, for example, in California, does that, and it's has a larger dedicated revenue source and has the bonding capacity to move forward with new projects. Much better, because it's very difficult to bond against, as you know, government appropriations or changing winds or anything like that.
And Mr. Chair, you said something I think is important to think about as you think about the future, is whether it's local your own agency operations or projects from a funding perspective, as you grow and get more of that, they require match. They're going to require investment from the local perspective. So, I mean, that's just the world we live in. That's going to be an issue.
Yep.
So, you know, whether it's just the operations or even that the project side of things, where does that come from? How do you get it? Where do you look at?
Well, you can also look at P3s. You can also look at a variety of different, municipal funding mechanisms for doing that. And the larger your revenue grows, the more you have bonding capacity too for projects. But yes, to your point, usually in transit that you need that local match component as well as potentially state component.
Is that something this agency should spend more time on, is looking at innovative funding scenarios and strategies?
I would think so.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Question, Mr. Chair? So,
Let's make this more, everyone just ask a question. We don't need to have
Yeah,
the
I'm just trying to
formality
get
of
you
record.
talking. I don't
Yeah.
have the answers. I just have questions.
Just chime in, we're a family.
so Commissioner Long probably knows the answer to this, but, so to have taxing authority, that's a legislative ask?
That's at a state level.
And is that something that, okay, they give us taxing authority and we figure out how we do it? Or is that something that, where the scenario goes, they give us taxing authority, then we have to each go back to our own counties and try and get that approved in some form or
Yes.
fashion?
I,
Or is it a one blanket regional ask? I have no idea how that.
I don't think that they would allow us to do a regional
I mean, it could be,
ask. I
say
think they
if,
would require each county to go back and approve it.
because it
So
seems
each
like
ca-
if each county
state-
did a 25-cent gas tax or something, or a
Your
25
county
quarter of a penny.
already has taxing authority.
Yeah.
You can put something on your referendum ballot, or you can go out and ask your citizens to vote on it, but you can't exceed those restrictions that are already in statute based on
Wait a
how much
second.
money you want.
So we already have the first 5 cents. We enacted the second 5 cents. What's,
On your gas tax.
But
Yes.
you,
But
are
where
you
else?
a charter county?
no, we are not a
They
charter
can't, they
county.
don't have the transit surtax then.
And I don't think Hernando's a charter county either.
They don't.
So,
Well, we're a charter county.
So we have the transit surtax ability.
We have the ability to implement one. We haven't done
Correct.
that yet.
To
Yeah.
ask for a referendum, and
That proves the point in terms of how challenging and difficult
it's going to be.
it would be from, getting the ability to get a regional tax. Not that it shouldn't be a goal or vision if you think that's where you should be. It's just not an easy process, and you don't have the ability today to
So
to
could the
do that. You have to ask
legislature give
others
us
to approve you
the
that
ability?
ability to do
The
that.
legislature could.
Have you
because
met
it's
the
like a water board.
legislature yet? It is highly unlikely that they would give us taxing
That was
authority.
my point now.
Yes, and if you haven't noticed, Florida is an oddball out as it relates to how we operate and how we fund things. So we're stuck with what we have until the legislature changes, quite frankly. That's just the bottom line.
I think how you succeed, though, in getting that funding authority is if we've already mentioned, if you have a plan, it's ready to implement, you've talk to the counties all agree and support it, and then the counties in turn say, we need a regional funding source for this. Okay, if we need to go to referendum in each county, and that's what the legislature requires, we'll do it. But we've got to have that groundswell support from the counties, so that I think then the legislature, I think, would be more apt to say yes, you know.
So here's an idea. We've lost our Hillsborough person, but the
Yes.
Pinellas people and
Two
the
Hillsborough people we lost.
both of them. But
lost all
we
the
have,
Hillsborough.
we have the Pinellas and the Pasco people, and you know that we have a legislative day that we've all been working on to all go together. So there's strength in numbers, and the people in South Florida, I know this from having worked in that arena since the 70s, they vote as a block in South Florida, Broward and Dade, and because of that, a lot of money has gone to South Florida for transportation needs and funding. Same with the Jacksonville area, and same with Orlando. So going as a group, speaking with the same voice and the same ask is how you end up getting changes done. And Ron is still here, I think, so.
I'm looking for him, but I'm wondering if this, is it this, I think it's too early to
I think
ask
it's too early
this
as
year.
well.
I
Yeah.
think that would be a goal for next year.
This is the
I
vision,
agree.
you know, not
Yeah.
the.
But I think what Commissioner Long is saying is
Correct.
that we plan to go up there January 15th, and this is step one.
Yeah.
If we
It's step
start
one,
showing
and it
some
doesn't
unity-
Let them know
we
we're
can't-
working on it.
Right.
Yeah.
We can't let them know that this is a concept we're working on, and we'll see what kind of response we get. I mean, we shouldn't miss the opportunity because Tampa Bay is in the leadership for the next
Right.
2 to 4 years
Exactly.
in the House and in the Senate. So if ever we're going to get our share, the time is now.
Are you gonna start with the Tampa Bay delegation meeting, or are you gonna?
Well, we've already come together. We've
Well,
been
I know,
working
but
on
I
this
mean,
issue.
just bring this idea up of what came out of this meeting to the delegation.
Well, I think we have enough, well, the public meetings are over for this session, but we do have an opportunity when we go on the 15th to all speak about what happened here and to let them know that this is what we're going to be working on and what we'd like to bring back and move forward on all this next year, if that's the will of the board.
Waterboarding, that's an interesting thing, but the timing, I was just thinking out loud. But,
Thought you said
transit.
we had to waterboard
Yeah,
someone
yeah,
there.
yeah. You got that in my mind. I wouldn't want to subject any of our legislators to that too early, but a transit gas tax ultimately provides the benefit you're looking for, and it spreads the responsibility out among the folks using your roads and your transit systems and the people buying gas at the pump, which includes other than residents. So you
Except
get it-
it's not
you get-
sustainable.
It's, well,
It's something, no?
what we're in right now is not sustainable. So, I mean, we need to find a path forward and a step to take. I don't know which step would be the best, and I don't represent the number of constituents you do, Commissioner Long, but we do have to force ourselves to a place where we get sustainable funding from a source. And that source may not exist today, so we may have to create one.
We're working on it.
Precisely, you gotta look at a whole myriad of different choices too. And even talking to, look at potentially dedicating, or they're already spoken for all the skyway tolls and other tolls. In the area.
Well, the Skyway tolls have to be spent in Hillsborough, Pinellas, or Manatee County. The excess tolls above and beyond what it's cost to maintain it. And there's a process to go through to get those. I don't think they've ever been used for transit before, but I'm not aware that they couldn't be, but I don't know.
I'm not, if they can't, I don't believe they have in the past been
No,
used for it,
yeah,
right?
but I don't know that there's a restriction. We could look into that, but.
So, are there any additional, like using, like Karen, using, and Janet, using the transit option you guys have in Pinellas, would there be a will on the board to do that?
I mean, we do, and we haven't implemented all the rest of our gas tax. I wanted to just address gas tax for a second. It's unfortunately not a high producer of dollars. and that's one reason why Pinellas so far hasn't taken the effort to put it into place. 1 cent in Pinellas produces about $3 million. So, you know, in truth, a dedicated millage and/or a dedicated sales tax would produce the kind of dollars that you're going to need to fund a regional system.
Well, doesn't the polling suggest, I mean, you guys are considering, I know, another penny for transportation now.
We
I think
can't
the
talk
poll-
about that here.
Well,
We have two people.
Okay.
Well, we are in,
No, it's a
we are in a
public
sunshine meeting.
Yeah.
but-
we're-
Yeah, but
I'm talking, you're
slippery
listening.
slope.
But I think polling statewide suggests that transit is on the top of everyone's list.
That's true.
Especially-
That-
Very high in my county, if
What's
not.
very high?
I think it's safety's number one issue, and then transportation is number
So
two.
rallying that cry with the people, the legislators are gonna listen to it, I think.
The interesting thing about the gas tax is it's a vote of the county commission.
Yes.
It's not a referendum, which it took us 2 years, but we did get 4-1 with 5 Republicans. And what we don't do in Pasco County is we have no road and bridge millage. So we don't
You have your
collect
Pasco
any
penny.
ad valorem for transportation. Huh?
You
We
your
have a
Pasco
penny for Pasco, of which a portion of that goes to transportation. That goes to capital projects of improving intersections, basically.
Well, I was
And then
talking,
the second 5 cents is going to also road resurfacing and potholes and things like that. But I do have some wiggle room in my road and bridge fund.
I was talking about the sales tax. I think even for
And
there,
I think
there is widespread support statewide for more, a sales tax for
But I-
transit.
Is that a referendum or a board vote?
That's a referendum, sales tax.
You mean if it was statewide?
No, I mean,
If we had a
each county
regional
has votes on the.
Quarter
like an
penny or
additional-
something.
The legislature would have to allow it and then
A
dictate
sales tax?
on a sales tax for, because they don't have
Oh,
a
for
Yes,
them.
not all the counties have the same
So they're not
ability.
the same as Pinellas, so you'd have to get the
ones that do,
legislature
yeah.
to grant it.
See, and
The ability.
and thinking out loud about a regional sales tax, then each county kind of pays for it proportionate to their budget, population. So, you know, I think that Hernando's portion would be much smaller and Pasco's. I think seems like an equitable way, but again, I have no idea the flavor of the legislature, but I think that's something we should put on the table.
So, you have the money, you have the project, who operates it?
Depends on the project.
I thought we already
Just
said
gonna
that.
go on to my
I thought TBARTA was gonna hire a contractor who
Well, I mean,
oversaw
that's the
whole
question.
thing.
You know, so are you the operator? Do you hire staff to develop the infrastructure to operate the service? Do you contract it out? You know,
We need to see the cost,
what
I think.
angles do you look at related to operations of service?
Typically makes more sense to contract that out.
Take the contracts down.
Yeah,
Even in our van
Professional
pool program,
operators.
we contract out the service, so.
correct.
Okay, that's an easy one, see? We got to an easy one.
We're in agreement.
Okay, move on, quick.
What about other types of regional service? You know, so, well, one of them is transportation disadvantaged
Okay.
services from a regional perspective. There's a gap there. It's really done at a county by county basis. So is there an opportunity? Is that something you want to engage in from the perspective of providing service and engaging in that arena? There may be others. Just, you know, we
I guess my question
throw
would
these
be,
kind of ideas out in terms of, you know, what to look at.
my question would be, how much of this crosses the region, the TD service already?
Right, that's the first, right, I don't
That's
know
your
the answer.
first-
We'd have to be able to determine what is that market,
Right,
to your perspective. right.
because if it doesn't, if it's in-county trips for the TD, then it makes sense for it to say,
Right.
I think, in the county.
Well, we
But-
do know from, just more anecdotally, from the van pool program, there is a need, particularly getting to the veterans facilities. You know, veterans are all around the county, and the facilities themselves are, you know, if they're going to Bay Pines or to James A. Haley, they're there is that need of trying to get service there. There are other providers, you know, in the mix, but it's an area that gets raised from time to time about, when you talk about regional transit, is that an area that TBARTA should be engaged in? I know David here has heard it. In the past, it's come up. So, you know, just, is that an area to at least explore, to see if there's an opportunity there to fill a need?
Well, it would be contrary to our understanding of the regional transit definition that you gave earlier, right?
There you go. Yep. It may, yes. It's certainly not fixed service.
Correct.
I think by nature, that sort of service falls under the purview of transit operations. And, you know, just as, you know, we don't want to compete with local service, with the local providers, we wouldn't want to compete with the local TD trips. So those trips would still continue as they already exist. But we're talking about potential TD trips for people that need to go to another county that can't currently get there.
Correct.
There's no way for them to get to those destinations. So it would be new service for people that don't have it today.
Could that be ancillary to Van Pool and things like that?
Mm-hmm.
Seems to make sense then.
So in that arena, to look at it, but going back to the definition of regional, we have to keep that in mind.
Correct, yeah.
Fair enough. Okay, let's, maybe I'm jumping around here because the discussion jumped that way. Let's talk about branding.
Oh, absolutely.
Commissioner, you remember that was something a decade ago we
Absolutely.
talked about. You know, and the look is, you know, you've got a new regional look, brand used for commuter services. All the operators have their own brands that's used for service. You know, how do we look at it? You know, does it be having one brand matter from a customer perspective, and then from the perspective of how do we get there? What are the considerations? Do you brand just the regional service? Do you brand all of the service? Do you co-brand with the different entities? Is there a separate branding for regional and local service? You know, and we've looked at in other areas where it's been, typically when you do this, it's really a phased approach over time versus getting to that ultimate vision. We talked about earlier, you mentioned, I heard Bart mentioned earlier, we mentioned Atlanta, we mentioned Phoenix. You know, there are areas, you go to New York, you go to other areas around the country, Dallas is another one, that are all branded as one service that are multiple jurisdictions. They're more than one county. You know, so what are your thoughts on where we should be heading from that perspective?
I think we should follow Joe Lopano's information he provided us today about the airport. Their infrastructure here is planned around the customer satisfaction. Customers would prefer one brand and be able to get an app and travel and not worry about whether it's this operator, that operator, whether this actually gets to this place or that place. So the more we can make our transit customer friendly, I think we're heading in the right direction. And he told us that worked for the airport here and started with the vision years and years ago, where everything was designed around the person coming here's ability to get from one place to another in 7 minutes. So, and they stayed on that from the beginning to the end, and it's turned out to be the best airport in the nation. If our transit positions that we take are from the rider's perspective, I think will be more regional, more comprehensive, and more beneficial long-term to our citizens.
I totally agree with Cliff, and another example I'll use is the immense success of SunPass. You know, how in different tolling agencies all use SunPass interoperably, but people see the large SunPass decal and they think of it as that, even though it might be an actual local expressway or whatever. So you may even have a co-branding, for example, TBARTA and PSTA, you know, together if you need purely local service, but have the TBARTA logo on basically everything to do with transit in the area, would be my suggestion.
there consensus on that? Everybody?
So, but I have to ask the question because I don't know the answer for every county. Would this also have to take legislative action in order to brand all of the bus agencies under one brand? No?
Well,
I mean, I don't,
I don't think that would rise.
because you have a different legislative act for Hillsborough, for Hart. You have a different legislative
Right, but you're
act
talking
for
about
PSTA.
individual agencies.
Huh?
You're talking about branding.
I know.
Well, that's not an act of the legislature, how you brand your bus system or how you brand your airline.
I'm
Or
just
how you-
asking the question because I wasn't sure what the legislative acts for each agency,
What's in the details?
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would think that the challenge with it going to the legislature, or the need for it to go to the legislature, is that one municipality cannot bind a future political body to their vote. They can simply, if it's at the county level, another county commissioner group could come around later and say, you know what, we really don't like TBARTA brand, so we're going to change it. So these types of, whether it's a funding mechanism, whether it's a branding mechanism, these things will need to be established in the legislative jurisdictional authority, which is why I asked at the beginning, the concept, the constraints of the discussion, because a lot of this stuff, if it's going to be regional, it's going to have to be
The statutes are
legislated
gonna
in
have
the
to
state.
stay it, right.
Precisely.
I think that's a good point, John.
For sure, and Commissioner Sill, you raised the point, and it was something we did consider, in this discussion, recognizing that those details of you do have different legislative actions, and that in some cases, people have argued they're counter to each other. What I mean by that is, you've got PSTA and HART that are also created in statute, as is TBARTA, and the question about are they all 100% consistent? And some would argue they are not.
Well, they're not, because PSTA was created in a local act and HART was created in general law. So by very virtue of those two different legislative actions, it makes them almost impossible to integrate.
So
That has been tried and not succeeded.
So
just
what are the
FYI.
things this entity needs to do to try to get over that hurdle?
Memorandums of understanding between the local governing bodies would do it. There are several ways to get it done that don't require legislative action. And for instance, we have a legislative memorandum of understanding between TBARTA and PSTA. That did not require an act of the legislature, we just did it, the two different boards.
And I think
A question-
co-branding is subject to contract, yeah, I would think it probably is.
But to your point about bonding, could you bond with different counties operating under an MOU?
Well, if you had a generalized revenue stream that went to TBARTA, you could.
But would it have to be something more than
Oh, you're gonna have to
revenue
have,
streams under an MOU?
you're gonna have to have much more greater
I think so.
legislation than an
Yeah.
MOU for the finance.
I wouldn't, I mean,
You have to have, you can do interlocal regional agreements that are subject to bonds, but very complex bonding agreements and all kinds of things go into that. An MOU wouldn't do that, but for the branding, simple branding of a logo, I think you probably could by contract, simple
So
contract.
that brings me, if I might ask, Mr. Secretary, how does the Department of Transportation, for example, build a road that goes through many different counties? What kind of legal authority do you need in order to go from one county to another county to another county with a road?
Yeah, I don't think we typically need that, but our projects do typically end at county lines, and then we pick another one up and start another project from the county line here. So you might have one project that's broken into two project numbers.
But there's no legal document or vehicle that allows you to just go from Pinellas to Hillsborough, for example?
Well,
I don't
state
think-
roads are, are defined in law.
Yeah, on the state road, I've never been asked that before, so. I don't know if any of my guys back there have any other thought on that, but, it's just never been something we've had to deal with.
Yeah, it's
State-
because you,
I think
State
they got
road.
their
It's your
authority
road.
and their money to go wherever their right-of-way
Yeah.
acquisition takes them, so. You would never be stopped at the county line or
you
state
buy the right of way
transportation
and you
project.
Well,
build it.
I guess ask it this way, if you wanted to widen a road in the county and the county said no, could you do it anyway?
Absolutely.
We could, doesn't
Yeah.
mean we would.
Well, but you could, so.
So here's another example, Commissioner Starkey. We have McMullen Booth Road that goes from Pinellas all the way up through Pasco.
Yeah, I need you to fix that light up there.
We don't need you, I mean, how did we
Getting
manage to
hammered.
cross the Pasco County line there? Or we went over the
But
Sunshine
your management
Skyline.
of that road stops at the county line, but that's not a FAP or state-owned road, that's a local collector arterial.
And the difference also, just to add whatever clarity to the issue, as a county road moves through municipalities, they have jurisdiction over stoplights, speed limits, et cetera, as it passes through their city, which
And the
is a
maintenance?
messy state law.
Do they have to take care of the maintenance too, right?
The county still does the maintenance.
Of a county road?
No, but I'm talking about if you
Of
go
a county
through,
road,
if we go through a
maintain.
municipality, does the county do the maintenance in the
We
municipality?
wouldn't do the maintenance on, say, a traffic light that they put up, but they
Some-
would,
Some cities do contract with counties to do it, but they have to actually have a relationship through the, like
They do
Hernando County
maintain.
maintains all the city of Brooksville. They do it through an
state
interlocal
does,
agreement.
or they pay the county for it.
So from the perspective of branding, because you raised some interesting points there, one of the things is as we've talked about the definition of crossing county lines, those things. Who's setting the standards for the service? Is it TBARTA who sets the standards for that regional
Yes,
project and service, or is it somebody else?
yes.
Yeah, there
If
should
you're
be a
going to have cohesive
uniform-
regional service, you have to have
Right,
one
yeah.
entity.
Yeah, if it's their
But it'd be-
brand, they have to set the service
Commissioner
standards.
Seal mentioned earlier that we should build these things locally. Whether we wind up at the legislative body eventually to discuss whether we need to enact any supporting legislating, we should brand ourselves, get our local agreements, and do that with the entities, so that when we go to the legislative authority, we're one. Because it makes it easier for them also.
You've got to have interlocal
So
agreements
if we
to
come
do
to
that.
them and say, hey, this is how we want to look, and this is our brand, and how we want our buses to look, and how we want to travel from service to service, they'll support us.
And especially if we have all of our partners agreeing.
From
Right.
your lips to God's ears.
Okay. And then with all of that discussion, the question I'll go back to, does this still fit
Yes,
in terms of goals and guiding principles?
yes.
Okay. So now what will happen, David, any further questions you want to drive home or ask? So what will happen is we'll take all this information, we'll provide a recap of it for you for the next board meeting. And really what it gets used for is for that development of the 2030 Envision plan. So now what are the pieces? Here's the plan. How do we enact the pieces? What are the steps needed? What are the elements missing in terms of being able to enact the plan? It's great to have a plan, but you want to have, what's the implementation strategy? How do you get to that implementation of it? And then, keep moving forward with some of the questions we had in terms of return on investment, in terms of branding, those type of things. Will still take more work. As we said, there's devils in the details. We all recognize that. We're looking for that high-level concept guidance, and I think from my perspective, in terms of the staff and the consultants helping them, I think we got some good direction from you all today, and we appreciate that. Mr. Chair, or David, anything
I
further?
totally concur with that. I think one thing that I suggested at a prior meeting too, that in certain dedicated TBARTA corridors like the BRT, for example, and the stops that hit multiple jurisdictions, there ought to be a consistency of zoning regulations too, and maybe through interlocal agreements. So, for example, a stop can't get held up in a certain community or whatever due to, some city zoning ordinance that prohibits that kind of setback or this sort of setback. I think we have to look at that at a regional and a county-wide perspective too, and maybe with preemptive,
Okay.
legislation to do that. I don't know whether everyone's in agreement, but I think obviously you want to have a local design, but I hate to see any of a project like this get held up at a critical junction because of, one municipality or one county being obstructionist.
Well, I think the very first step goes back to what Mr. Manuel said, is we've got to engage the local jurisdictions more and have them buy into the vision.
Correct.
Yes, sir.
I do have one other question. You brought up a point about service standards, and, we talked about regional branding, and we obviously talked about funding. I'm not sure we touched on regional fair structure. I know we've got the Flamingo Regional Fair Card Project that's moving forward and should be implemented maybe February-ish, March. But I'm curious, any thoughts on a regional fair structure?
Well, you mean if someone's getting on in Pasco County on a bus and heading south?
And they're gonna get off in Manatee.
So the fare for a local trip is different in each county. If you ride Hart, you pay a fare. If you go to PSTA, it's a different fare. If you go to Pasco, it's a different fare. Each locality sets its own fare.
It seems like it should be distance travel. Does it work that way, or?
He's saying ferry means the rates are different.
Well, I think we ought to employ more of a variable pricing depending on the congestion in the area and things like that.
Within local
Is that most jurisdictions do.
travel, or? Are you talking within the local county travel, or are you talking when you head into a regional travel?
Either. So if you are on a bus in Pasco, and think of it in terms of a regional network. If you're on a bus in Pasco and then you travel into Hillsborough, what fare you pay for each vehicle. In terms of a regional network, should we think about standardizing a regional fare structure, or leave the fares as they are, which I think are at the discretion of each locality?
Yeah, that's a big discussion that I would need more people here than me. But I can tell you, in Pasco, like, we just gave county employees free bus rides, and veterans don't pay for bus rides. So I don't know if any of the other counties do that.
But I know for example, if you're in Manhattan and you want to go to Long Island, you pay a fare. If you're in Manhattan and you want to go from 34th Street down to Greenwich Village, it's X, whatever it is. So, I mean, it just depends on where you're going. And I don't know what the formula is, but here's what I do know. There's enough bus systems and transit systems in this country that we could collect the answers to that question from a variety of them and then make a decision based off of what other entities or regions in the country do.
Well,
Right?
I would add to that too, that we need to, if we're going to maybe do an RFP for operators or have multiple operators, you need to consult with them on the economics of it.
Exactly.
Before we put the cart before the horse in terms of pricing, because, you got to get the operator that makes money, and it makes sense to do this.
But ultimately, from a concept perspective, is that ultimately where you start to look at? I mean, for sure, you get the individual financial components that has to get worked out, but from a concept, many of us won't be here 30, 40 years ago from now. Is that the concept that it's one branded system, it's one structure, of rates, maybe different operators, but it's one simplified rate structure, I think is where David's headed.
So if the parameters are it's a TBARTA branded transit trip, whether
Right.
it's within county or whether it's cross lines, if you're using one app and it's a branded app, one would think logically that the rates would be commensurate with the distance or hub that they
You'd
stop
have,
at.
you'd have potentially variable rates and peak hours and different
Correct.
things too,
But
so, yeah.
it would be done at the TBARTA level is
Right,
what I
right,
think you're
yeah,
asking.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like if you're on a BRT lane, that would be more than just regular
Absolutely.
travel within your county.
The rates would be different structure inside our brand. What they're asking is, should all operators that are branded TBARTA have the same rate structure?
Yeah,
And
but
from
do
a
they have
citizen
the
standpoint, they
same pay
should.
structure?
They would, same pay structure, but I mean, it
Salary.
cost you more, it could cost you more within the system, but it wouldn't be different from operator to operator. All operators that are under TBARTA would have the same rate structure.
But that means that their cost of operations within that, because if I understood, the idea was that we're gonna have separate, like Hart would still be there, and maybe I'm misunderstanding, that PSTA would still be there, but they would be TBARTA branded. But then you have their operation costs, which may be different than my operation costs, because we have different level of standard, different level of service. So there's a lot to work out in
Yeah,
that kind of
I
thought.
think we don't have the data points to say there's one.
'Cause we don't have
Obviously, we
Sunday
want the oversight to do that, but we don't have the data points to say that.
Fair enough.
Transportation, Hernanda's is gonna be the same as transportation in Hillsborough.
Well,
cost.
don't you agree, though, that we can collect that data
Oh, yeah,
from
yeah.
places like Atlanta, New York,
course.
Phoenix,
Yeah,
Minneapolis, St.
I'm
Paul?
saying that.
Yeah.
One final thing that I'd like to bring up, and I think we all share this because half of us are going down to the automatic, the autonomous
Autonomous.
vehicle summit in Miami, is the role on-demand and rideshare will play as the last mile or as we integrate this system in a seamless way. Because we can't deny that's gonna happen maybe sooner than later. We all know, as Joe Lopano pointed out today, that who would have thought 10 years ago that you'd be paying for your daughter's ride in a guy you call up on your cell phone.
Somebody who does it, I know. I
So we could be there
appreciate that.
sooner than later, so I think we need to, in addition to the core stuff we're doing, look at the role of autonomous vehicles and on-demand services integrated into our system too.
Okay.
Is everyone in agreement with that?
Didn't hear you.
You guys in agreement with? No, that we need to integrate within the program the role that on-demand autonomous vehicles and or on-demand vehicles are gonna play as the last mile or as part of the system.
Yeah, that's another.
That's what I'm saying. Good.
Okay, great meeting.
Can I go back to the rate discussion for a minute? Because I think Bob asked us a different question, and I just want a consensus from the board on is it a desire to get to a place with a common rate structure? I mean, that's what you were asking in the vision, right?
From a
But you said 30 years
high-level
out.
conceptual level,
Would we like to
yes.
be branded TBARTA and have a common rate structure
Right,
as a
conceptually.
goal?
Right.
Understanding that there's a lot of issues
Lot
to
of
work
issues
out
to work
before you
out.
got there. But with no goal in place to even pursue it, we wouldn't try to work out the
Well, I'm gonna be
issues.
representative
But to me, it seems like we should want one, a common rate, for our customers' perspective again.
Looking at it just, but the way I would describe it most simply is looking at it being seamless and easily understood by the customer.
I think it should be a goal.
Yeah. Baby steps.
Okay?
No waterboarding.
Okay? Well, Mr. Chair, David, that's all I have, so appreciate it.
You got the direction you needed?
All right, I'll accept a motion to adjourn the workshop.
Adjourn.
Adjourn, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Fine meeting as always. As always.
Daughter had a